Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting lecture by your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald J. Brown. Our topic for today is the Jewish history of Queens. On the right, you see me. That's my cat. That's where I live in Jerusalem. I lived in Jerusalem for 5 years. Was there during the Yom Kippur War and all of the turbulence, and an exciting time. So I've been, interested in the history of Jerusalem and that. And of course, when I moved to Queens in early 1990s, I started researching the history of New York City. And part of it is the Jewish history. The outline, the history of Queens, a little bit about it emerging as a distinct entity, first as a county with lots of little towns, then later as a borough of Greater New York. The arrival of the first Jews, the golden age of the early 1900s, golden age of cemeteries. They say there are 10 times more dead people in Queens than there are living people. The Forest Hills Rego Park area, which is a whole new chapter in the Jewish history of Queens, and then famous Jews of Queens. So, why don't we get started with our discovery of a less known chapter in New York Jewish history, that of the neighborhood of Queens. Well, when people think of Queens, right away, they don't think of skyscrapers. They don't think of famous people other than possibly the Trump clan. But it is generally considered the place where New Yorkers go to sleep at night. You work in Manhattan or wherever you work, and then you go home to your modest little house, such as this is the Archie Bunker House at 704 Hauser Street in Astoria, Queens, one of the more famous neighborhoods of Queens. So it is a modest one-family house. Today, very often you will see what we call a bathtub Jesus, an upturned bathtub buried in the ground with a statue of Mary or Jesus inside it. Or more and more, you will see Hindu flags flying from the windows, or a house like this turned into a ground floor Buddhist temple with the priest or the family living upstairs. And this was, as Archie Bunker reminds you, it was the golden age of middle-class America, which made Queens their home. We all know All in the Family, which dominated the airwaves from 1971 to 79. Those years were important because those were the economic crisis years of New York, where the city almost went bankrupt. Central Park was overgrown and wild, and neglected parks in Forest Park in Queens. The subway was filled with graffiti. So when the theme song for All in the Family looks back at Queens, for them, it was an ideal little world. Glenn Miller played songs that made the hit parade, none of this wild music today. Guys like me, middle-class working guys, had it made. We didn't need no welfare state, all these people doing nothing and living off of the government. Everybody pulled his weight. Those were the days. And of course, girls were girls and men were men. I mean, none of this sexual liberation, which was raging in New York in the 70s, the Stonewall, and today, good Lord, transsexuals and, men dressed as women and women dressed as men and having surgery to become something different from what they were born. I mean, so this was the golden age, and this is what Queens meant to most people. A golden age where everything was stable, life was ordinary. Nobody was a millionaire, but then there were no poverty, single mothers living off of welfare and charity. You went to church on Sunday, and for the Jews, you went to your synagogue, and everybody pulled their weight. Well, this is the stereotype of Queens. Well, where did Queens come from? Well, here we see the 13 colonies that we know, and today the states along the Atlantic coast. Well, before the English took over the Dutch colony of New Netherlands, it was a very different situation. The map in the middle shows the yellow area, which was claimed by the Dutch as their colony. They also claimed the green areas. The green area at the bottom would be today's Delaware. And the English had their little Boston and New Hampshire and Maine colony. You can't see it very well in the picture, but you see Long Island was claimed and settled by the English, except for the area which eventually became the county of Queens, which was controlled by the Dutch. So the English and the Dutch shared Long Island. The Dutch wanted to kick the English out, and they were not strong enough. And the English wanted to kick the Dutch out, but they were not numerous enough. And so the Dutch were building towns. We see in the left Fort Good Hope, which is today Connecticut. That was the dividing line between the Dutch and the English colonies. So that's why it was a fort. Going up the Hudson Rivers, Schenectady, Beverwyck, Fort Nassau, Fort Casimir, that would be down the Philadelphia area, Swandal, which is Delaware today, and cities on what is today Staten Island and Queens. We see Brooklyn, which is today Brooklyn, New Utrecht, Gravesend, Jamaica, 1656, Hempstead, 1644, Flushing, 1645. Here again, these were the outlying areas that the Dutch established to confirm their claim to the land. Well, the border between the Dutch and the English was rather fluid and heavily contested until a treaty of 1650 divided the Dutch and the English claims. The Dutch lost what is today all of Connecticut. And the border on Long Island was confirmed, a straight line going north and south. And so that basically delineated what is today Brooklyn and Queens as Dutch colonies from the English colonies on the rest of Long Island. The English took over the Dutch colony in 1664. And that was the end of the Dutch possessions. The English established the colony of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Connecticut, and divided up the Dutch Empire. So Queens County came into existence in 1683. Nassau County, to the east, was carved out of the English part of Long Island, and that was formed as late as 1899 when Greater New York City was established. So initially, Queens County was a county, which meant it had a county seat, Towns had their own mayors, their own schools, their own libraries, their own police force. So places like Flushing, Queens, the old Dutch town of Vlissingen, still has their own city hall. But of course, it's now part of the borough of Queens, which is part of New York. So the mayor of Flushing was abolished, and you had one mayor in Manhattan for all of the 5 boroughs. So by 1683, Queens County was laid out. Early settlements grew in this area. Astoria is where the X is. That's where LaGuardia Airport. And we see Queens is today that green area, but it also includes JFK Airport, a lot of the islands in the bay, and the extension out into the Atlantic Ocean. Places some are well known, such as Astoria in the far north, Long Island City, Woodside. For me, these are all subway stops. You have South Ozone Park. You have the far Rockaway area, Rockville, Queens Village, Kew Gardens, Elmhurst, right in the middle of the picture where I live. So the Queens emerged as a new area, and it was filled with villages, small towns, each with its own mayor, each with its own police force, as part of the county of Queens. Well, Queens had a certain reputation. It was not only popular middle-class people, but it was also noted as a mixed area as early as 1657. The first settlers of Flushing were not Dutch, even though it was the Dutch colony of Vlissingen, but it was land that the Dutch gave to English Baptist settlers, English Quakers who settled there, and other miscellaneous English religious groups that wanted to escape religious persecution in England. And the Dutch welcomed them, said, well, to go out to this frontier area and build a town, make farms, cut down the trees, make businesses, and be loyal to the Dutch colony. And they were eager to defend their independence from the English, which were not all that far away. Well, Peter Stuyvesant at one point in 1657 sort of got sick of all of these crazy miscellaneous people and thought he should establish some type of religious uniformity for the colony. And so he rounded up some of the leaders of the Baptists and the Quakers in Flushing and said, okay, it's time to leave. You know, we don't want you anymore. You're causing too many problems. The Baptists were especially nerve-wracking because Baptists, as the name implies, only baptized freely consenting adults. None of this baby baptism, forcing a child to become a Christian, even if it can't express its wish. Baptists were opposed to any coercion in religion, whether it was circumcising Jewish and Muslim babies to force them to become Jewish no matter what they wanted. The Baptists said you can only become a believer in Jesus when you freely choose it. So they protested and sent a letter to Holland, which controlled the area at the time, and in this letter saying, we demand the ancient religious freedom that Holland was noted for. And interestingly, they not only demanded religious freedom for Presbyterians, Independents, Baptists, Quakers, or what else, but also extending to Jews, Turks, and Egyptians, which was a revolutionary document saying that people should have total freedom of religion, and not just the traditional Christians who lived there, but extending it to Jews. It was a very small community of Jews in New York City, probably no Turks or Egyptians, which today we would simply refer to as Muslims. And Peter Stuyvesant was irate that these people in Flushing would question his authority, but Holland sided with the residents and said, we have to keep this colony strong. We have to welcome immigrants, because if we don't populate this colony, the English are going to march in and take it over. Well, which they did in 1664, not even 10 years later. So the Baptists, the Quakers, Independents, Presbyterians from Scotland were allowed to stay. This Flushing Remonstrance, the text of which still exists in the archives up in Albany, really was the first major event of importance in Queens, because it is considered by many to be the inspiration for separation of church and state and freedom of religion. So that war, conflict between the religions would not happen, because everyone would be guaranteed religious freedom. So Flushing and Queens became famous already in 1657. Today, Flushing has the oldest Quaker meeting house in the United States, and it is also the oldest house of worship still existing in New York City. All the other ones were burned during the Great Fire of 1776, which destroyed most of Lower Manhattan. Well, the first Jews arrived. Now, here again, it's difficult to identify certain dates and the first persons, because a lot of these settlers didn't have records, or they would change their names, or you had one Jewish family living in a town, chances are the children would marry the neighbors down the street and assimilate and disappear, as did most of the early Jews who arrived under the Dutch. You have to have a certain number of people before you can maintain a synagogue or any communal Jewish life. And of course, for Jewish synagogue services, you have to have a certain number of men to have a legitimate worship service. Well, the first known or suspected Jews was a man named Edward Jessup. We don't know too much about him, but many of the Jewish documents at the time referred to him as being Jewish. And so, based on that information, most people say that he was the first Jewish known resident on Long Island. He lived in a town called Newtown, which is where I live. It is just beside the center of Queens in itself. So gradually, the town of Newtown, as we can see, included a huge section of what is today Long Island City. And it was a place of farms of ordinary people. Well, this particular Edward Jessup became the magistrate in the 1660s of Newtown. The Dutch name was Nieuwestad, which simply was translated as a new town. By 1700, the town had 1,000 people, and we do know from the census records, which were then taking place under the English, that in 1700 there were 405 youths under the age of 16, 434 adults, and 161 African slaves. We tend to forget that New York, at the time of the American Revolution, was the second largest slaveholding city in the United States after Charleston, South Carolina. The slave market was an institution on Wall Street, where all the banks and businesses and wealthy people lived. And so most of these African slaves would have been living with a white family and involved in agricultural work, or maybe working with a blacksmith or a carpenter or something, because these were urban slaves, typical of New York slaves. So they weren't growing cotton, and there weren't large plantations employing hundreds, but they would be parceled out to individual families. Well, by the 1870s, Queens started assuming a distinct Jewish population. The majority of the Jews coming to Queens by the 1870s, this is the time of pogroms in Russia. And Eastern Europe had been divided up between Germany, which we see Prussia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which controlled Galicia, and the Russian Empire, which included Lithuania and the Jews of Bessarabia and what is today the Ukraine. And the period of, this is called the shtetl period, when most of the Jews lived in small towns. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and they started migrating to the United States. On the map on the left, we see the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Austrian Empire. There's no Lithuania, there's no Poland or Czechoslovakia. These were all absorbed. The Austrians controlled a huge area. Germans and Russians basically controlled the Jewish population of Eastern Europe. We all know about the large migration of about 500,000 of these Eastern European Jews to what became known as the Lower East Side of Manhattan. That is below Delancey Street, East Houston, East Broadway, Henry Street. The main streets of there, we have Allen Street, Clinton, Norfolk, Suffolk. These are the huge areas of the Lower East Side. By 1900, there were approximately 500,000 Jews crammed into these areas, living in tenements, living in poor conditions, usually no running water, no electricity. The streets were dirty. They still used horses and buggies. And, the garbage disposal was basically just throw it in the street and some of it'll rot or somebody will sweep it away. And so that became the major Jewish residence in the 1870s. Turning the Lower East Side into an Eastern European Yiddish-speaking city within a city. Gradually, Jews started leaving the Lower East Side very often as quickly as they could. They wanted to get out of the slum-like congested conditions. And don't forget, during the summer, there was no air conditioning. Mosquitoes would breed in stagnant water. Malaria, cholera raged. Danger, gangs would raid people, attack people, rape. And it was definitely not a very pleasant place to live. Well, we do know that a major event of 1888 was the establishment of the Hebrew Benevolent Society of Long Island City, just across from Manhattan. This was the Hebrew Benevolent Society. Now, this is the East 77th Street on Manhattan. On the right, we see the Long Island later building. Now, a benevolent society in the time of 1888 was a society that helped new immigrants. It provided a burial insurance service, since half of the babies at this time didn't survive for their first year. Women died in childbirth. Men were killed on the job or got ill. The Benevolent Society took care of people as much as it could. If you had a baby, you would sign your baby up with the Benevolent Society. You'd pay a small fee every week or every month. And if, unfortunately, the baby shouldn't make it to its first year, the Benevolent Society would provide the baby with a decent, respectful funeral. Women who became widows or husbands disappeared could appeal to the Benevolent Society for help. The Benevolent Society very often ran the orphanage. It took care of elderly people who were ill or abandoned. It provided food for the impoverished. And so this was a major event showing, number one, that there was a good population of Jews already in Queens, and that they were well off enough to support an institution such as a benevolent society. The first known synagogue was established in the 1880s on Long Island City. The building was destroyed in 1981 by a fire. The founder was a gentleman named Israel Eisenberger, and it was the Orthodox synagogue, Mishkan Israel. And there we see Temple Mishkan Israel with its male members, which meant that there were enough families to support the infrastructure of an Orthodox synagogue. Now, when you have a synagogue that had to have a teacher, maybe you couldn't afford a rabbi, a trained rabbi, but there probably were a couple of people who had the rudiments of the Hebrew language, could lead prayers, could train the children in at least basic ideas of Judaism, and maybe even support a kosher bakery or butcher. And so the community started building its infrastructure. And this was Orthodox. So Yiddish speaking from Eastern Europe, whether they had passed through the Lower East Side and then migrated to Queens, we don't know. But as you can see from the population, there were a considerable number. An interesting event happened in Astoria. Anybody who knows New York knows Astoria is an exciting place. We think of Greeks and Armenians and Arabs and Jews and Hispanics, and really quite a diverse community. Well, a lot of the Jews of the United States, in fact, most of the Jews eventually of the Lower East Side, abandoned strict Orthodox rituals, and they started creating a more American style religion, patterned after the various Protestant churches. They established the egalitarian synagogue, which is today associated with the conservative Jewish movement founded in 1921. Gradually, the Jews of Mishkan Israel, the Orthodox, said, oh, well, we have to get away from Yiddish and learn English. We have to get away from these old European traditions and Orthodox Judaism and black hats and all that kind of stuff, and become part of modern American society. As the name Egalitarian Synagogue says, that today, as you can see from its mission statement, that they are all individuals. They are Jews regardless of race, sexual orientation, gender identity, or family background. And so, like the modern forms of Reform Judaism and conservative Judaism, a lot of the Orthodox Jew rituals were loosened. Many Jews didn't bother with kosher food. Maybe only on a major holiday would they try to keep up some semblance of kosher. Large amount of intermarriage, where a Jewish partner would marry a Christian partner, and like the Reform said, that Judaism could be passed on by either the mother or the father, which was a step away from Orthodoxy. And so the building was constructed in 1925, which we see, which still thrives as a very open, welcoming synagogue for anybody. That Judaism is not a race; it is a religious community of believers who anybody can join, and this is one of the major institutions of Jewish Queens. The Astoria Center of Israel in Astoria has magnificent murals painted by Louis Pierre Rigal, and this is the Astoria Center of Israel in Astoria, another institution in Queens. Well, the 1900s, the early 1900s, really marked the growth of Judaism in Queens and around New York. As the population of the Lower East Side started spreading out from the area, Jews started moving to other neighborhoods, such as Queens. We had a big Jewish community in Harlem, the Jews of Brooklyn, crossing over the Brooklyn Bridge, the Bronx Jewish Hall of Fame. And so by the early 1900s, there were 20,000 Jews in Queens, out of a estimated population of 1.5 million Jews in all of New York City. Now, these statistics you have to be careful of. How do you identify a Jew? Orthodox would not consider a conversion done by a Reform rabbi as actually constituting a Jew, and they say that a Reform or a conservative or Reconstructionist Jews are not real Jews. Judaism is passed on through the mother or an Orthodox conversion. So many people say we don't know how many Jews were there. In addition, many people migrated to the United States. They would simply change their names and assimilate into Protestant society. This was very common in the metropolis of New York, with millions of people. It was very easy to change your name on your documents and just become a regular American. And if you say you're from Germany or Russia, you could easily assimilate, or what African Americans say, pass into white Protestant society. Corona, bordering on Flushing Meadows Park, has its congregation Tiferet Israel, which is an Orthodox synagogue. And it was German Jewish refugees from the Lower East Side who moved to Queens and established their own synagogue. Now, very often when the Jews would arrive, they would cluster into ethnic groups. Many of the small synagogues of Lower East Side have the name Anshe in front of them, which means simply the people from. And so you might have the Lubavitchers. They would be Anshe Lubov, meaning the people from the town of Lubov. And when they came to the United States, many of them continued that tradition. So when they established the Orthodox synagogue in Corona, they just started identifying themselves as Anshe Corona, the people from Corona. Now, Tiferat Israel means the splendor of Israel. And this is the oldest structure built as a synagogue in Queens. Now, here again, you have to analyze words. It doesn't say it's the oldest synagogue because many synagogues were simply houses where the ground floor became a little synagogue, or later on, they would buy a disused church and turn it into a synagogue. Only when they had enough money and enough members could they buy a lot and build their own synagogue in their own unique architectural style. Now, this one is rather modest. It's a wooden building. It's not covered with gold or anything like that, but it was built by the congregation. Incorporating the Gothic windows, the pointed windows, and the little oriental decorations along the top. And so this would be typical. Now, when the Jews migrated, or any other religious group migrated, they would use somebody's living room as a house of worship. Later on, they would rent maybe an old storefront and turn it into a house of worship. Later on, they would buy a disused church or some other building and turn it into a house of worship. The final stage was building a new, unique structure with your own particular architectural style. This is where we see the Eldridge Street Synagogue in the Lower East Side, which was built in a sort of a Spanish Moorish architecture with all kinds of Jewish decorations. So gradually, they started organizing communities in Queens. This is the interior of the synagogue today. You see, it's Orthodox, which means that the reading area, the pulpit, is in the middle of the building. And you see that it has the typical bima with the Torah scroll and all of the accoutrements of an Orthodox community. The Free Synagogue of Flushing was part of this golden age of Judaism in Queens. And this was a new Americanization of Judaism. Traditionally, every synagogue had a committee headed by a president. And the president was charged with running the synagogue, paying the bills, collecting money, and hiring a rabbi, if they could afford a permanent one, or rent a rabbi for holidays. This was the job of the president of the congregation. Traditionally, the president and his committee would receive a copy of the rabbi's sermon for the upcoming holiday or Sabbath, and they had the right to censor it, to say, you can't say this, you have to talk about this. And so the rabbi was basically an employee of the committee which ran the synagogue. Well, Rabbi Stephen Samuel Weiss from Manhattan came up with the idea of Americanizing it, making the rabbi into the spiritual leader of the synagogue, reducing the power of the president to censor what he said, and saying the rabbi should get up and speak truth. If something is going on in the city or something is going on in Judaism, the rabbi, as an educated person, should have his opinion respected and have the freedom of the pulpit. And that's what the free synagogue movement was. The pulpit will be free and untrammeled, free to voice without free or scruple the high moral and spiritual teachings of the synagogue. This has always been a major issue. How should Jews deal with Israel? Are the Jewish people a race? Are they a religious community? Should Jews support the state of Israel? And today, with what's going on in Gaza, many rabbis are very critical of the Israeli government, and they get up in the synagogue and express their opinions. And if you don't like it, you can find another synagogue where the rabbi takes orders from Israel or some Jewish committee, or has a completely different perspective on political, religious events. And so this is the Free Synagogue as we see it today, built in 1921, still a somewhat flourishing synagogue, beautiful Greek style building with big pillars in the front. Most of the Jews have moved away from Flushing now, as like every neighborhood in New York City goes through periods of change. It is now Flushing. When you say Flushing, you think of Asians, Chinese, and whatnot. Stephen Samuel Wise was born in Budapest, died in New York, and he was a candidate for the Temple Emmanuel. This is the first Fifth Avenue Temple Emmanuel that was built on Fifth Avenue. Today it is now replaced by the newer one. But he demanded freedom of the pulpit. Well, the president of Temple Emmanuel evidently didn't agree with him speaking his mind and said, you will follow my orders. And so he was a candidate for Temple Emmanuel, but he was rejected. And he said, the question whether the pulpit shall be free or whether the pulpit shall not be free, and by reason of its loss of freedom, reft of its power for good. So he was insistent on the fact that rabbis should speak their mind. Another reject from Temple Emmanuel was Felix Adler, who found he was rejected because he said, I am an agnostic. And he said, you don't have to believe in God to be Jewish. It is a tradition, a spiritual tradition, and that belief in a deity is not all that important. And so he tried to strip down Judaism of a lot of its trappings of theology, gods, rituals, creeds, and stress Judaism as a moral social action. He was rejected by Temple Emmanuel as well, even though his father was the rabbi at the time. And he founded the Ethical Culture Society in 1877, which still exists and is directly across the street from Temple Emmanuel itself. Well, Jackson Heights started emerging as another garden apartment neighborhood, and it was open to everybody. Some neighborhoods, like Forest Hills Gardens, was basically restricted to good white Protestants, no Catholics or Jews, whereas Jackson Heights was much more of a middle-class neighborhood. And behind these buildings, which you see on the street, there is a garden, which is for the residents of the building, with trees and flowers and benches. And so it was called a garden apartment. And here, Jews, Catholics, everybody was allowed to live and build their own houses of worship. This was the Jewish center of Jackson Heights, which was established in 1919 as a Queens Independence Society. Gradually, became a conservative, associated with a conservative movement. But it shows again the Americanization of Judaism. It's not the Jewish synagogue or the Jewish temple. It is a center where you could play basketball, you'd have sports, you'd have sewing classes, dancing classes, meals for the elderly, daycare for the children. And then for those so inclined, you could have your Sabbath service on Friday or Saturday, whatever you wanted. Once again, Jackson Heights is predominantly today a Hispanic neighborhood with a large Indian and Asian population. And places like the Flushing Synagogue or the Jackson Heights Synagogue are starting to lose members. Young people move away. The average age when I was there a year ago, they said was 80. And so it is largely becoming just a community center for gays and lesbians and all kinds of other groups, and hopefully earning enough money in these activities to keep the place operating as a Jewish center. Forest Hills Gardens by Frederick Law Olmsted's son was another one of these Queens neighborhoods which were planned. Here on the right, we see the Forest Hills Gardens Hotel with a couple of shops, and it was a planned neighborhood. It was also restricted. Now, there's a big argument whether anything was ever written into the contracts that no Jews or Catholics would be allowed, but it was one of these planned neighborhoods. Until today, the only synagogue in the area is out at Forest Hills on Queens Boulevard. Inside the garden, there are 3 churches, and they are all Protestant. Queens is famous for its multitude of cemeteries. New York City permitted burials in Manhattan. And on the right, we see Trinity Church, the Episcopal Church on Broadway, surrounded by its burial ground. And on the left, we see Shearith Israel Synagogue, dating from 1805, right in the middle of the city, with its tombstones. And so there were, cemeteries and burial grounds throughout the city. In 1851, the city banned burials below 86th Street, meaning new cemeteries had to be built and established above 86th Street in Manhattan. Well, many cemeteries said, well, the real estate is too expensive in Manhattan. Queens was the logical place to build new cemeteries. It was still the county of Queens in 1851 and would only become part of New York City at the end of the century. And so many Jewish, Catholic, Protestant groups started moving their cemeteries to Queens and Brooklyn. There are 29 Jewish cemeteries in New York City. 18 of them are in Queens. Some of them are well known: Mount Hebron Cemetery, Mount Hope, Mount Judah, Mount Lebanon, Mount Zion. Third, Shearith Israel. First 2 are in Manhattan. The third was in Manhattan, and then they started moving to Montefiore Cemetery is famous, and gradually Queens, because of its relatively cheap land, became the magnet for cemeteries. Old Montefiore Cemetery has 160,000 burials. Now, this is very famous because this is where Rebbe of the Lubavitcher movement is buried. And he was hailed by many of his followers as the Mashiach, or the Messiah. And the Jews of the Lubavitcher movement gather around, praying to him as a saint, as if he were a saint, sending him messages with little pieces of paper. And they expect his return to life and his reign as the Messiah. So the old Montefiore Cemetery has become a major, I won't say tourist attraction, but a religious sacred site for many Jews. The Lubavitchers are growing in strength. Their headquarters is in Brooklyn, and their goal is to save the lost Jews. I have a friend, he was a shliach, which means an emissary, or some people call them a missionary, to find Jews who have assimilated and return them to the Jewish fold. My friend worked up in Alaska. And I said, I didn't even know there were Jews in Alaska. And he said, oh, I found a couple. And they referred to them as the Frozen Chosen. A wonderful book on the Lubavitchers by Sue Fishkoff called The Rebbe's Army. Mount Zion Cemetery, found in 1893, is a major cemetery because it contains the memorial for the 146 victims. Most of them were Jewish, but there were also some Italian immigrants who died in the fire of March 25th, 1911. And there is a beautiful memorial there to commemorate this memorial, or to the tragedy. In fact, the Shirtwaist Factory, which was in what is today NYU campus near Washington Square, was such a shock that it spurred on a whole series of laws, labor laws, requiring fire exit sprinklers, fire truck ladders that could reach the tops of these new skyscrapers going up. The last known victim was Rose Rosenfeld Friedman, who died in the year 2001 at 107, and she was buried at Mount Zion Cemetery. Here on the left, we see the memorial to the workers who lost their lives. To top in the middle, we see the famous incinerator in Stacks because, Queens is a growing neighborhood and has all of the infrastructure of a major part of New York City. So it might not be elegant, but, it shows we are in the city. On the right, we see one of the gates in the cemetery. Cemetery entrance gates are part of art because it is very much part of society and part of religious architecture. Another area that has blossomed in recent years as a major Jewish neighborhood is Kew Gardens, Forest Hills, Rego Park. Right in the middle. If you look at the map on the right, you see Jackson Heights, where we just visited. Below that, we see Forest Hills. Now, I live in the red area called Elmhurst, and then we see Kew Gardens, and this whole area has now become a major Jewish goal for new immigrants moving to the city. These are no longer Eastern European Orthodox or German Reform Jews, that this is a whole new movement that began around World War II and is now growing in importance. This is the Rego Park Synagogue, a conservative synagogue on Queens Boulevard, dating from 1939. And as you can see, it has its very beautiful memorials. And once again, it has sort of rebranded itself as a Jewish center. And I've gone to concerts there. They have an auditorium where local orchestras perform, daycare, and other activities. So that marks really the beginning of the rise of Jewish Regal Park Forest Hills. Today, it is estimated that there are some 200,000 Jews in Queens. We look citywide, 12% of the residents are Jewish. It were Jewish in 2002. The population has increased until over 1 million. But if we look at the statistics, we see that today the largest concentration of Jews is by far in Brooklyn, over 500,000. Manhattan, 250,000, Queens approaching 200,000. Well, the population density of Queens is increasing as more and more people move. Queens Boulevard is being filled with 10-floor apartment blocks. And it's considered by many people to be the fastest growing Jewish population in New York City, the Kew Gardens, Forest Hills, Regal Park area. That they say half of all people are living in Queens are part of a Jewish household. Now, here again, statistics can be dangerous because so many people are in mixed households where some of the kids will practice Judaism, some of the kids will practice some form of Christianity or Buddhism, or practice nothing. And so it's very difficult to have statistics. Many people do not join a synagogue or a Jewish organization, but they simply show up as a guest if the Spirit moves them for a religious service in some place. It is estimated that the area, Forest Hills, Regal Park, Kew Gardens, 49% of the households in this area are, to some extent, Jewish. Whether they, like I said, whether they identify, whether they practice or anything, it's hard to say what is the actual statistic. And it's the same with every religious group. How do you number Catholics? These are members of a church? Well, no. People who were raised Catholic, people who went to a Catholic school. Such statistics have to be taken very critically. Following World War II was a movement, time of great growth. Kew Gardens, Adath Yoshun in 1949, once again showing the Kew Gardens Synagogue, Adath Yoshun, and Community House. And it was once again but the classical shul with a pool, meaning the basketball area, card playing area, fitness area usually was the centerpiece of the building. And people, if they were so inclined, would avail themselves to the synagogue. And this was the beginning of the baby boom generation, where soldiers returned from the war. Country was aflush with money in the roaring 50s and 60s, big families. And so they moved to Queens, and these were flourishing community centers. A number of people remained Orthodox, or they wanted to preserve some orthodoxy in their neighborhoods. And so they decided to establish the eruv. An eruv is a string or a rope that is passed from building to building, street light to street light, traffic lights, to surround this area. It basically declares that this area is no longer part of New York. It is established as if it were a household. And so Jewish women can push prams with babies. People can carry packages, things which they would not be allowed to do outside of the home on the Sabbath. But by declaring this huge area as a home, as the Eruv permits Jews to push a pram or carry a package in this huge area. There are several Eruvs in New York, especially in Brooklyn. Well, synagogues were part of the landscape of Queens, especially following World War II. We see the Temple Gates of Prayer on Bound Street, 1960. Forest Hills Jewish Center, 1949. These were built following the war, catered to large families, and now are being abandoned as people move from Queens to places on Long Island. They'll move to New Jersey, upstate New York. Kids grow up, go to school in California, end up staying there. The old people end up dying or moving into nursing homes. And so a lot of these beautiful post-World War II synagogues are now being closed, sold, even demolished. Some are being taken over by the new residents of Flushing and of Forest Hills, and being turned into Buddhist temples, Hindu temples, mosques, and even Catholic churches for the growing Hispanic populations of the Queens. A new chapter of Queens was inaugurated following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Here we see the emigration of Soviet Jews beginning in 1989, reaching a high point in 1990, and continuing on for several years with a huge migration that lasted well into the 20s. With so many former Jews from the former Soviet Union migrating to the city. Well, Queens ended up becoming a magnet for these people. The Bukharians. Bukharia is a place in Central Asia, which had a large Jewish population. They started moving to Queens as soon as the Soviet Union started declining. Today, there are 40,000 in Forest Hills with their own grocery stores. They just built a brand new mosque, which we see down at the on the bottom left-hand corner. If you look closely, you'll see it is the Jewish Community Center. Once again, having all of the outreach activities of any community center. Forest Hills has been called very often Queenistan after Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and by many of these people were very wealthy, and the Jewish oligarchs from Russia, who, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, grabbed everything they could. And they're building these infamous and ugly McMansions, buying expensive sports cars, and totally changing the architecture of Forest Hills and Queens. Bukharia is, if you look at the map, you see Russia at the bottom, and you see Kazakhstan, And below that is Uzbekistan, a sort of a grayish colored republic. And within Uzbekistan, there is the province of Bukhara, which is has a large Jewish population. Most of them have since migrated to the United States or Israel. They were their origin, nobody really knows. Many people say they are Turks and Muslims who simply started practicing Judaism, and missionaries from Europe discovered them and started introducing Western European style Jewish practices. And like the Ethiopian Jews, the Bukharians had developed their own form of Judaism, which was rejected by the Jews from the West, from Israel. And in the United States, they have more or less conformed to the orthodoxy practiced by the Jews from Eastern Europe. They have their own dialect. It's a Judeo-Tajik dialect. And there are a lot of different dialects and languages in this area. They're derived from Persian or Turkish. And so you have the Tajik Persian, Uzbek Turkish. A lot of them speak Russian, since in this area they sided with Russia to get into universities, become medical doctors, tax collectors, and other activities, which definitely made them not loved by the indigenous people. They use Hebrew, which many of them have learned, and they also, many of them speak dialects of Aramaic, which replaced Hebrew. So it is a unique culture that has settled in Forest Hills and left its mark on the Jewish history of Queens. Well, here again, we see Beit Gavriel, which is on 108th Street, a Bukharian housing development. Rabbi Aaron Aronoff he said, "We hate the word melting pot. We are not going to melt. We are going to preserve our identity." Many people refer to him as ruling over Regostan, as in Rego Park, or Queen of Queenistan. A very ruthless but inspiring leader, out to keep the Bukharian Jews from marrying Russian and German and Israeli Jews, keep them pure and keep them away from Christians and Muslims and Buddhists. So very autonomous ethnic community. He established the Bukharian Jewish Museum. They maintained their own kosher grocery stores, restaurants, entertainment areas, preserving the customs and the traditions of their Uzbekistan homeland. Another group that blended into the melting pot, which they don't like to use that word, but have migrated to Queens. Along Yellowstone Boulevard, there is a large concentration of Jews from the Republic of Georgia. Here again, we see the Republic of Georgia with Russia to the north, Armenia to the south, and Azerbaijan. A large population of Jews from the Republic of Georgia have migrated to Queens, and here we see their synagogue on Yellowstone Boulevard. Many of these people arrived with lots of money. You never ask these people where they got their money from. But they have definitely been throwing it around. We see one of the McMansions, which consider a desecration of the neighborhood, gaudy Donald Trump style, low class, super wealthy. The old Forest Hills Gardens was a very genteel white Christian neighborhood with German Jews who had joined the neighborhood in modestly built homes such as the one on the right. So anybody brings up Forest Hills and everybody always has an opinion on the McMansion Wars of Forest Hills. Many of the Russian Jewish oligarchs, Abramovs, Cantor, Friedman, Avin, these were the people who seized control of the Russian economy when the Soviet Union collapsed. They funneled trillions of dollars to causes in Israel, causes in the United States. They are the ones who put Putin in power. And they put Zelensky in power in the Ukraine. And so many of these oligarchs find themselves at war with each other. Some supporting the Jewish leader of Ukraine, Zelensky, others supporting their man in Moscow, Putin, which is one of the reasons why Israel has stayed out of this war, because the Jews are on both sides fighting over who is going to control the former Russian Empire. Wonderful book, Once Upon a Time in Russia, The Rise of the Oligarchs and the Greatest Wealth in History. Well, there is a lot of drama going on in the Bukharian community. The Bukharians have a reputation for being rather violent and temperamental. Recently, there was the Bukharian doctor guilty of ex-husband's murder. Jewish woman brutally murdered in Queens over Pesach. Here again, all kinds of things happen. I taught for a good number of years at the Toro University, and it was Toro College campus. And everybody said you never give a Bukharian Jew a bad grade because they will hack into your computer, they will track you down. I was almost run down by a woman who was irate that she didn't get an A+ on her grade. She tried to run me down with her Hummer on the street leaving the campus. I mean, they are notorious for burning each other's houses down, going into inter-clan wars. Well, Queens has a large number of famous people to its credit. Tony Bennett and Lady Gaga, famous Jews of Queens, the lyricist Lawrence Hart, who wrote the music for A Lady is a Tramp, Bewitched. So many of the famous musicals were written by Hart, who is buried in Queens. He was part of the Rodgers and Hart team that really was central to the flowering of Broadway shows. Estee Lauder, Josephine Esther Mentzer, the cosmetic firm, was born in Queens, grew up in Queens, 1908, and once again, following the war, made a fortune in ladies' cosmetics. Today, it is a Fortune 500 company with 17.7 billion in income. So another very famous Queens personality. Good old Bernie Madoff, the largest Ponzi scheme in history. He was born in Laureltown, Queens, the Wizard of Lies. Another famous personality from Queens. Howard Stern, Private Parts, from Jackson Heights, the shock jock. Say anything and do anything on his radio and TV empire. Paul Simon, Art Garfunkel, Arlo Guthrie and Burt Bacharach, also people who emerged from the towns and neighborhoods of Queens and went off and became famous. Alice's Restaurant was not in Queens. I have often wondered where Alice's Restaurant was, probably in San Francisco or someplace, but still, they didn't write songs about Queens. I mean, they don't see Simon and Garfunkel singing about how much I love Queens. Most people were glad to get out and to move into an area where they could become famous. And so Queens remains a place which has produced great people, but it remains a nice place to live without the towering skyscrapers and all of the other buildings that we associate with New York. So that brings us to an end. Once again, the Jews of Queens, the history of Queens is fascinating in its own right. New York, the big city, and its little neighborhoods, that still marks Queens, even though Flushing, as you can see on my YouTube video and on my book on the right, A Religious History of Flushing, Queens, every neighborhood changes, constantly evolving, constantly becoming a different neighborhood. Flushing, going from Quakers and Baptists, then middle-class whites, and then today, Chinese, Asian. So it is definitely an interesting place. So my book is on the right, and this is part one, my YouTube on Flushing, New York, tracing the history of an exciting neighborhood. So if you'd like to contact me, ronbrownmedia@gmail.com. Love to hear from you, and I hope to see you sometime in the future. Thank you for joining me, and have a great day.